We're now going to enter into the philosophical, more ethical points that I want to make about chatbots. And just to let you know what's coming, I've created a test for you. I've looked at a specific disease, which I've chosen psoriatic arthritis, okay? And I will be giving you an analysis. And I've applied I've gone into 4 of the top chatbots, and I've placed very specific symptoms into the bot, and basically assessing how did the bot perform and if it actually complied with certain ethical checklists that I analyze these bots with. And I'm going to take you through each of the ethics checklist points, because this is what, when you're analyzing new technologies for yourself, you can use this in exactly the same way. So I'm basically modeling this for you. So let's get into the ethics of it. When operating in a diverse, pluralistic, and multicultural society, healthcare providers are confronted with ethical choices regularly. With so many competing ideas, bioethics principles provide moral action guides. So, oopsie daisies, let's just go backwards. Respect for autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice are all ethics principles that you should have come across in your career. I'm going to briefly look at each one of these, but then I'm going to look at a checklist of how I actually applied these into the chatbots. So respect for autonomy. This is a principle that was really defined by Immanuel Kant. The thesis that he put forward helps us to understand why we have respect for persons. And this defines the fact that he believes that we have duties towards one another, that we should follow specific principles in order to be moral human beings. And with that, there are categorical imperatives, universal laws that can be followed at all times that tell us what is right and what is wrong. All right, so that is the thesis of Immanuel Kant in a very, very simple way. Now, one of the most key statements that came from Immanuel Kant is that we should treat people at all times as ends in themselves and never merely as means to an end. Now, I'm sure you folks have all heard of that at some point or another. And applied to medicine, we say that patients are ends, not a means to an end. And this is so important when we're looking at new technology, because technology providers do not come from a medical background. They look at patients as consumers, and they do not necessarily desire to put the patient's ends as a priority over their own ends and their own needs. But of course, if they as technology providers didn't provide a good service where patients felt safe and where they got a correct diagnosis, for example, then of course people wouldn't use their services. So in many ways, when patients come to technology, the ends of the business actually align with the ends of the patient. The needs of the business align with the needs of the patient, because the business wants the patient to have a great experience and come back. But what's, I think, quite difficult for technology providers to realize is that when we come to medicine, we come to it with a very different perspective. We are there almost in an altruistic sense, don't we? We come to it with a belief that the patient needs to come first. And so this tenet, this principle of respect for autonomy, gives us guidelines such as the fact that we need to obtain informed consent from patients, the fact that we need to respect the confidentiality and the privacy of a patient, and always, always putting patient need above greed. I looked at a certain number of things when I was analyzing the chatbots. Number one, I looked at the data and privacy policy. Obviously, that would be very, very key, right? So I looked at whether the app had summarized the data policy. I wanted to see that it was more than just a link saying privacy policy, and it was hyperlinked and there was a little checkbox. I wanted more than that. So I was assessing these to say, did they take information from the privacy policy and then distribute it out over a few pages so that, for instance, when you were clicking through, you could see different pieces of the privacy policy and perhaps consent to different parts of the privacy policy and then ask for more information and things like that. For me, that would be the most ideal format to share the privacy policy. Then I looked at whether the privacy policy contained information about healthcare consent specifically, because many privacy policies are not targeted to patients and they don't have anything about medical records or anything like that. Then I looked at the policy itself. Believe me, I read 4 full policies. And I looked at whether they were easy to read, and I tried to assess this and ask myself, if somebody, say, has a matric, they don't have, tertiary studies, would they be able to understand this? Does this have legal jargon? Is the writing big enough? Something as simple as that could make a privacy policy really difficult to read. Another one was I looked at, does this privacy policy have lots of subheadings so that it could highlight parts of the policy? So things that are really simple, but if those are there, then I believe that the app is making an attempt to respect people's autonomy. I also looked specifically at retention of information. How does this policy keep health records? Where does it store it? And how long does it store records for? And I also looked at the idea of being able to withdraw consent, to delete your data, to opt out of having this information shared. And then I also, out of curiosity, I also looked at whether the privacy policy was explicit in explaining to people that health data is being consumed by the machine learning algorithm, and the machine learning algorithm is learning over time continuously from the new data that's being inputted into it by the user. So I was just curious to see if they were open about the fact that these are learning algorithms that consume this data and learn from it. I'm actually just going to pop up now and see if there are any other questions. Jan, am I correct in assuming that the chatbots are diagnostic media only, or can they prescribe treatments? Okay, Jan, very good question in just helping us understand these chatbots. They give a diagnosis. After the diagnosis, you may click on that disease and you enter into a kind of encyclopedia about the disease. It says what the treatments typically are for that disease. It says what your prognosis is. And I think it also says causes. It really gives loads of information about the disease. And I'm going to be playing a video for you later, and you'll be able to see what it looks like. Yay, Vaynand and Helena are back. Well done, guys. All right, Jan, I think that answered your question. I think you guys will really enjoy the video that I have created for you. Okay. Respect for autonomy. There's a last note on respect for autonomy that I really want to make very clear. I assessed the transparency of the bot. So my question was, did this bot make it absolutely clear that the person, the patient, is dealing with a piece of software, a machine, an algorithm, rather than dealing with a person? a human being. And I also wanted to know whether the bot makes it clear that there is no human supervision taking place over the conversation. I find that really, really crucial to respecting someone's autonomy. If the person is not truly informed, if they do not understand what is taking place within that engagement, I don't believe that they have truly consented to that engagement. So many times, perhaps developers and UX designers make a lot of assumptions about what people understand when they approach technology. And I believe that when it comes to healthcare technology, that it is absolutely crucial that the person understand that they are talking to a bot, because they may have an incorrect expectation that someone's actually overseeing this conversation and that they're somehow protected by a healthcare provider who's there to look after them. And many patients still rely on that sort of paternalistic relationship with that healthcare provider. They want that doctor or that dentist to really just take over and just lead and guide the way. And they're actually very desirous of that in many instances. And I think that it's really important for patients to realize that when they're talking to a bot, there's no one there playing Big Brother, helping them out, that no one's going to jump in and say, oh, that's not right, or whatever the expectations might be. So I look for transparency. It's really important that the patient trusts the technology. And in order to build trust, we need honesty and transparency. Non-maleficence. I don't know how many of you are familiar with these terms, but just very simply, non-maleficence means do no harm. Do no harm. And what's really difficult about the principle of non-maleficence in bioethics is that we have to create this arithmetic of harms. Do the benefits outweigh the harms? And for a healthcare provider, when you are looking at a patient and you're assessing whether or not to use a bot in your practice or to place your patient the first line of care being a healthcare bot, you need to make this type of arithmetic of harms, and sometimes it's really difficult to calculate what all the harms might be, when you're looking at a patient holistically. But in terms of non-maleficence in the chatbots, I looked at a couple of things. So the first one was whether or not the person was advised not to use the bot in times of emergency. Because, of course, in ethical terms, we talk about times of additional vulnerability. So any type of vulnerable patients I put under the category of non-maleficence, do no harm. So advised not to use in pregnancy. I thought that was important. I don't think people should use these bots when they're pregnant. I think they should use health bots that are specific to female health, and that the machine learning algorithms are trained on data that is specific to pregnant women. That's my opinion. I'm looking at this through ethical eyes. And then lastly, age. Obviously, we approach minors differently to what we approach adults, and we apply even more stringent ethical tenets to dealing with minors. Beneficence. Beneficence is sometimes very difficult to separate from non-maleficence, but beneficence is about doing the good of the patients, doing what is best for the patients, and applying a benefit to the patient, or a benefit to even society as a whole. So with technology, there's a very strong argument for technology from the ethical principle of beneficence, because there can be so much more benefits to so many more patients with new technologies. Under the topic of beneficence, I looked at things like whether the app was set up in such a way that every time it asked you a question about your symptoms, if you were given loads of information, so if you couldn't understand the question, or if, say now it asks you, do you have high blood pressure? Now, we must think about somebody who perhaps doesn't know what high blood pressure is. They can't just be asked, do you have high blood pressure, yes or no? What about if they want to understand blood pressure, or they actually want to exit the conversation or speak to a real doctor at that point, or have a telemedicine conversation at that point? I felt that the bots should provide those types of options to patients. Of course, very key is, to the benefit of the patient, is to always refer them to a healthcare professional. I think this is almost like so obvious that it goes without saying, but the bot needs to recommend that the patient see a healthcare professional. And it also, I think, needs to recommend what type of professional. So it should say, you need to see primary care, a specialist, you need to see emergency care, etc. So I feel quite strongly that that aspect needs to be part of the chatbot conversation. UX design is user experience design. I think that the flow of the chatbot needs to be set up, obviously, with the patient in mind. I think that's quite an obvious one as well. Lastly, we have justice. In bioethics, I'm just going to read what it says on the left there. Justice refers to everyone having an equal opportunity. This principle seeks to eliminate discrimination in biological research and in healthcare. It states that distribution of health resources should not be based on gender, race, religious beliefs, or sexual orientation. Those are just some of the examples. So when I looked at the chatbots, I was looking at things like, is the patient treated fairly? Are there any signs of prejudice that I could pick up? So the bots asked for gender and age. All the bots asked about gender and age. And then, and just FYI, some of the bots did ask, it said, are you male or female? And then underneath it had like, request why there are only 2 options. And it had like, unsure or other. And then, but that actually led to a different process. So you actually exited the bot if you didn't want to answer male or female. So that was quite interesting. Then one asked about smoking. Are you a smoker? And another one asked up front about diabetes. Do you have diabetes? So are these prejudicial? I don't think so. Because this is a context of healthcare, a bot can get away with asking these types of questions. Now, if this was about, let's say, legal advice or financial advice, or you're doing a loan application and the bot asked about gender, I would probably question as to why the bot was asking about gender, because then it could be seen as prejudicial. So there you have an example of that. And then I don't want to go into much of this, but let's just look at the last one. Is the app accessible? Was it easy to find? Is it cost effective? Is it aimed equally at all people who require it? So I was just looking at how accessible is that. And just so you know, the symptom checker apps that I looked at are all free. They're all available on iOS or on Google. And yeah, they were easy to find. And I suppose if you have I suppose you could argue that it's not accessible if you don't have a smartphone and internet access. So maybe for the poorest of the poor. But then maybe you could also argue that the person could potentially go into an internet cafe or a McDonald's where they have a Wi-Fi and, you know, and use it there. And that's maybe a lot cheaper than having health insurance and going to a doctor. So at the end of the day, these bots are going to refer you to a healthcare professional 9 times out of 10, depending on what you have. But yeah, I want to say that I feel that they were quite accessible. They were fairly accessible.